Hello, I'm KAMAHL SANTAMARIA. This is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, your weekly look at the world of business and economics. This week, Venezuela. It has the dubious honour of being the world's worst performing economy. Hyperinflation is so bad, people carry backpacks stuffed with cash to the local supermarket. We'll look at how this once rich country became a model of monetary misery. Also this week, Zimbabwe, a country where not long ago the price of a meal could rise even while you were eating it. Those days of hyperinflation have settled, but now it too is facing the threat of food shortages. And a game of Texas Hold'em. Saudi Arabia's oil minister's been in the United States, but as the price languishes, he's faced the very producers he's trying to force out of the market. For so long, the story of Latin America was about growth, the emerging markets where everyone wanted to be. But for some countries in the region, oh, how things have changed. Like Venezuela, a country of 30 million people who live in what is now the world's worst performing economy. Rationing is part of everyday life, even for essentials. The army has to guard food supplies. But how did Venezuela get itself into this mess? Well, the short story is one of economic mismanagement on a phenomenal scale. You see, Venezuela bet everything on the price of oil remaining high. And with government revenue 95% dependent on it, the plunge in oil has sent the economy reeling. As a result, GDP is predicted to contract 5.8% in 2016, the third straight year of negative growth. And Venezuela has the world's largest inflation rate, the IMF expecting it to reach 700% this year. Last week, you'll remember President Nicolas Maduro had to hike petrol prices by 6,000%. So with all this, fears are growing that Venezuela soon won't be able to afford its debt repayments. In fact, bonds are already trading at levels that suggest a default is priced in. We're going to focus on the food issue right now because it's such a critical one, obviously. Would you believe the food shortages are so bad that President Maduro now keeps dozens of hens himself just to lay eggs? And in that same vein, he's urging everyone to try to produce their own food. Alessandra Rambietti has our report.
Amidst the concrete jungle, an oasis of locally grown vegetables. A public garden in Caracas where Venezuelans loyal to the government gather to learn how to grow their own food. Rosiris Suarez is hoping to replicate what she learns here in her struggling community.
The price of the basic food items have risen out of control because of speculators and smugglers. So we've heeded the call of our president to grow to counteract the situation.
It's an idea the government is taking very seriously, with widespread shortages and out-of-control inflation. So seriously that President Nicolas Maduro announced the creation of a Ministry of Urban Farming, saying he's out to set a good example.
The First Lady and I have 60 laying hens and produce what we eat.
Just a few hours outside the capital, in once rich agricultural land, many believe the president should focus on the plight of traditional farmers.
Urban gardening, it's an interesting alternative, but not a way to solve such a big issue.
Agricultural engineer RICARDO Ramos shows us a plot of lands that are being left idle. He blames the lack of seeds, herbicides and price controls that force farmers to sell their produce at a loss.
We import 80% of all food items, and the little we produce here is simply not enough to satisfy national demand. We used to be self-sufficient in some items like rice, but that's gone.
Venezuela could grow most of its own food thanks to large expansion of fertile land. But through the years, most of its agriculture has been abandoned, and other farms like this one have been expropriated by the government, and production has collapsed. Norbelis Romero joined a cooperative of farmers a decade ago on land in government hands. While production soared at the start, in time they've been left without resources. The little they grow now is usually stolen by hungry neighbors.
There's nothing we can do to farm more. I'm not asking for me, but for all of us. We owe this to our President Chavez. What would he say if he'd see the level of abandonment? I think he'd die again.
A decline in food production that risks turning into a full-blown humanitarian crisis.
And this is the thing, Venezuela's slide is way more than an economic story. A little earlier in the week, I discussed that with Patrick Duddy. He's from Duke University in North Carolina in the US, director of the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies, but also a former US ambassador to Venezuela.
Yeah, the situation in Venezuela is dire, and it is dire in many different ways, socially, politically, as well as economically.
Do you think it's actually more a matter of when Venezuela defaults rather than if it defaults? When I look at the numbers, I think, gosh, it's just not looking good.
Well, the financial reports that I have read would suggest that the country will manage to make its debt service payments, which are due this month, but there is considerable speculation on whether they will be able to service the debt that matures in the fourth quarter of calendar year 2016. Certainly the government has indicated a willingness to pay. The question in financial circles is whether they will have the wherewithal.
You were ambassador between 2007 and 2010. Obviously a very different time it was then under Hugo Chavez. Can you tell me, from your experience and your knowledge of Venezuela, what do you think it will be like if things get even worse than they are? Is there, I mean, there must be potential for a public uprising.
Well, yes, I was there from 2007 to 2010 with a period of months in the middle of my tenure after being expelled by President Chavez. I returned early in the Obama administration to finish my tour. We've seen several episodes of social upheaval in recent years in Venezuela, but I think the reference point for many people is what's known as the Caracazo, which was a widespread uprising in 1989, which followed an attempt by the government to substantially increase gasoline prices. In 2014, there were also nationwide demonstrations against the policies of the government, and there were some 40-odd people killed, several hundred injured, any number of people arrested. It has been interesting, I think, for Venezuela observers to note that since the end of those nationwide demonstrations, there has been relatively little violence surrounding the various protest activities which have been organized. I think this is because the opposition in the last year or so has invested all of its efforts in rebuilding their political base, and they were successful last December in winning control of the national legislature. The problem that so many people see right now is that the gulf which has opened between the opposition and the government appears to have become wider, and I think some sort of effort from the government is going to be necessary to bridge that gap. To date, they've been very reluctant to acknowledge that their own political and economic project has largely caused the economic difficulties which the country is experiencing.
So we see there from what Patrick told us that economic mismanagement has been a big contributing factor, as it was in Zimbabwe, which also suffered from years of hyperinflation. And now, 15 years after it embarked on a sometimes violent land reform program, Zimbabwe's government is issuing leases to white commercial farmers. The theory is it'll help address food shortages and revive the flatlining economy. Haru Mutasa has more from Mashingo, south of the capital, Harare.
We need lots of eggs.
Helen Mitchell has been farming in Zimbabwe for decades. She's one of the few hundred white farmers left. She's constantly worried.
Come on, lay some eggs.
That she'll be kicked off the farm.
It's like living on a knife edge because you never know what's going to happen tomorrow or next week. If you want to go further forward with your projects, then you actually don't know that you're going to achieve what you want to do, and if you're still going to be there to reap the rewards.
But she could soon have some form of security. The government now says it'll issue 99-year leases to whites who are providing a service to the community and working well with the locals. This is the only commercially run hatchery in Masvingo province, selling around 100,000 chicks a week. Before land reform, when many farms were seized from whites and given to black Zimbabweans, there were around 4,000 white commercial farmers. The Commercial Farmers Union says there are about 400 white farmers in Zimbabwe, but some aren't farming all of their original land. Much of it was seized during land reform. But some farmers say issuing leases won't revive the stagnant agricultural sector.
The land has been given to senior beneficiaries, politicians, people in the civil servants and all that. They work during the week there. At weekends they go back to their farms. They're not producing anything there, yet we are faced with starvation. There's a lot of land lying derelict. There's multiple farm ownership that needs to be sorted out. There's agricultural facilities, irrigation facilities that are not functioning at this stage. All this is part and parcel of the land reform program, which needs to be addressed.
Land ownership is a sensitive issue that causes racial tensions. Most new black farmers who benefited from land reform also don't have leases. Zimbabwe used to be called the breadbasket of Africa. The government hopes better security of tenure for black and white farmers could help the economy grow again.
And still ahead on counting the cost, it's accessories rather than the actual phones which have been creating a buzz at the World Mobile Congress in Spain. We'll take you there a little later in the programme. Let's look now at the latest in the economic story that affects us all and just doesn't go away: oil. Different location this time, though. It's Houston, Texas, the oil capital of the United States, which has hosted a kind of Davos of the energy world. Executives and leaders of oil-producing nations gathered to talk about that global glut in oil that has pushed prices to record lows. And one of those leaders was a very important player from here in the Middle East. John Hendren has more.
The last time the Saudi oil minister saw the Houston skyline was after the global economic crash of 2008.
Although Dan only invites me in a crisis.
Now he's back with an outlook that could hardly be bleaker. Many oil executives here would like to see a coordinated cut in production. With a line consciously borrowed from the movie Wall Street,
greed, for lack of a better word, is good.
He offered reassurance to an industry in crisis.
Ladies and gentlemen, fossil fuels are good.
But he dashed all hopes that Saudi Arabia would slash production.
So there is no sense in wasting our time seeking production cuts. They will not happen. What will happen is we will all, as major producers, find it easy to freeze production, let demand rise, let some inefficient supplies decline, and eventually the market will balance.
Saudi Arabia has already joined Qatar, Russia, and Venezuela to freeze prices at relatively high January levels. But analysts say a freeze is unlikely to turn the market around any day soon.
I think the freeze wouldn't change the market dynamics that much, because of the 4 or 5 countries talking about the freeze, we anyways do not expect an increase in their production.
That leaves the oil industry in crisis for the foreseeable future. The International Energy Agency says the market won't rebound until next year, and oil now at $30 a barrel won't hit $80 until 2018. And already low prices are hitting the economies of oil-producing nations. Norway's oil minister says it will be years before oil prices return to pre-crash levels.
But the market will rebalance because of this resources in depletion, and that will happen, I guess, sometime next year. But we will not see a rebalancing in the market involving sustainable oil prices over $100 a barrel.
Another dour forecast of a long dry spell for oil.
Meanwhile, Nigeria's president was also talking oil when he made a week-long trip to Saudi Arabia to meet King Salman. Oil prices and market stability were high on Muhammadu Buhari's agenda, especially given Nigeria is struggling to really keep afloat due to a lack of diversification away from oil. Have a look at these numbers. It confirms how precarious things are. Nigeria's total debt rose to $65.4 billion in December of last year. The currency collapsed to record lows. Inflation is now up at 9.6%, the highest level since 2012. And Nigeria's deficit's expected to rise to $15 billion this year, which is 3% of GDP. Well, to talk about Nigeria's changing fortunes, we welcome back to Counting the Cost Amy Jadasimi, the Managing Director of LADOL, a private industrial free zone in West Africa which deals with oil and gas. Amy, if I was to believe the headlines, and I don't always, but if I were, then I'd be thinking it's a pretty bad time in Nigeria at the moment business-wise. Broadly speaking, how do you feel about the current conditions with the currency and with the oil price?
Broadly, I think things are moving in the right direction. I would say that the local private sector still has a sense of optimism. Times are tough, but if you look at the budget, for example, and we've only seen the highlights of it for 2016, the amount of money that the government has put aside for CapEx has tripled since last year. And what we're seeing is the government policies that are coming out are in line with the government rhetoric, and that's moving in the direction of more industrialization, more local investment. And that's a positive thing. I think what's happening with the oil price presents an opportunity. As the managing director of one of the largest infrastructure investors in Nigeria, I'm looking at this as a huge opportunity. When prices are low, it's a time to invest so that when prices go back up, we have the infrastructure ready to provide the services.
But what do you do, quite simply, in the short term about the fact that there's just not as much money around anymore? I mean, this is what every oil-producing nation is finding at the moment, that the belts are being sharply tightened.
There aren't enough dollars around, or there aren't as many dollars around as there were before. So this calls for fiscal responsibility. What's important is what the government does with the money it has, what the government does with the naira it has. What's also important for us in the private sector is that, and this needs to happen as soon as possible, what's also important is that the government quickly ensures that industrialists, companies which are investing in building capacity, have the dollars they need to buy technology, to bring in the services, to bring in the materials they need, so that we can build this capacity that the government is supporting.
OK then, we'll leave that side of things there and look more at the currency problems. Tell me a bit more about Nigeria's currency problems, specifically about the devaluation of the currency and the effect that you think it'll have over the course of 2016. I've got an article here which I've read which says, quote, a bleak 2016 for Nigeria because of that currency issue.
I think the currency issue has been misinterpreted. The vast majority of Nigerians do not care really what the exchange rate is. The vast majority of Nigerians can't afford to import goods from abroad. Where the devaluation debate has relevance is in the areas of industrialization. It affects the middle class, it affects the upper class. The middle class is enormously important. So what we want to see is how the government is going to make sure that those in the middle class, that companies like LADOL who are investing in infrastructure and development, how are they going to make sure that we have access to dollars? And let's be clear, there are enough dollars in Nigeria. It's just a matter of making sure that those dollars are spent in the right place. In the past, when the oil prices were very high and the market was flooded with dollars, from what we can see now, a lot of those dollars weren't spent in the right place. So the size of the pie hasn't really been Nigeria's problem. Nigeria's problem has consistently been how that money is applied. And from what we've seen of government policy so far, and from what we've seen of companies in the private sector that are now coming to the fore, the real private sector, whatever dollars are made available are going to be spent on investment in long-term developments.
If we talk about available money, there's also a move by the Nigerian government to look overseas for that. It talked to the World Bank. It's also looking towards China for about $2 billion in loans, I think. What sort of, or do you think it's a good strategy? I wonder if it's a bit short-term to sort of plug some holes and make sure things tick over just for now.
Thanks. I can't speak for the government, but looking at it from a private sector perspective, and coming from a company that has a lot invested in Nigeria, I'd have to say that I'm comfortable with the government strategy. This doesn't look short-term. They've put a budget together, and that budget has a deficit. And the deficit, by the way, is less than 5% of our GDP. But rather than on a short-term basis going around looking for money at the last minute, ahead of making those investments, ahead of even spending the money, the government seems to me to be shopping around for the best possible form of debt financing. And there's nothing wrong with debt financing. The problems that we've had in Nigeria, the problems that the world has had over the past decade, have been caused by imprudent spending, investing money in assets that did not produce a suitable return. So our government, it seems to me, is going around shopping for the best way of financing economic development and growth in Nigeria, and I think that's a perfectly valid thing to do. But what I would ask them to do is to very quickly let us know in the local private sector, let the international community know how they're going to deploy those funds. How are they going to invest? Which industries, which sectors are they going to invest in first? And what mechanisms are they going to use? What banks are they going to use to give those of us who are making those investments access to the money? And that's important not just because the money needs to be spent now, but also because I feel that the international community is also poised to invest in Nigeria. And the sooner we send a signal to the international community about where those areas of investment are going to be, the higher the leverage we're going to get. So our vice president has been saying for some time that he's going to invest $25 billion in infrastructure. And if he lets us know how that money is going to be deployed, that could end up being quadrupled through other investors coming in locally and internationally.
Finally, it's that time of year when the titans of the technology industry gather in Barcelona. It is the World Mobile Congress, where they show off their newest products. This time round, though, it seems accessories rather than the actual devices are the things that are creating the buzz. Our science and technology editor, Tarek Bazley, is there with more.
I'm going to introduce you the new Nexus 6P, which is the best mobile. It's the first Android smartphone that has the pressure sensor.
Or another module design such as a B&O.
It's a hard sell these days.
That's what makes LG G5 fantastic.
For years, mobile phone makers have enjoyed golden times. Year-on-year increases in sales as billions around the world bought smarter and smarter phones. But now the industry's under pressure.
We went through a decade of innovation, from candy bar phones to flips to sliders. There was always a reason to upgrade. That's starting to diminish. You can get software updates on your devices, getting that they last longer. So therefore the reason to upgrade is getting tougher.
And it's these that are the issue. Dozens of new handsets, but all in all they're largely indistinguishable from last year's models. If phone makers are unable to come up with smartphones with significantly new and better features, it appears customers are willing to hold on to the ones they already have rather than upgrading.
If phone sales are down, then why not put the technology to other uses? If your dog has a tendency to run off, this high-tech collar allows you to track your animal's exact location at all times.
The ability to tag and follow becomes really relevant. So, for instance, your animals, you can fit them with a collar, you can follow them. The latest technology allows the batteries in those devices to last for up to 10 years.
Mobile operators are also eager for your phone number to become the main way you're identified online. This virtual shopping screen, which is installed at bus and metro stops in Dubai, lets you shop on your way home from work.
Maybe a couple of pears and a bit of tea. And you have them in your basket. You check out here. Simply by putting your mobile phone number in to the device here, it will verify your address. So you give sends you a passcode, you type the passcode in, and the service knows your address and knows where to deliver it.
Some of the smaller companies are still trying to pack more into less. This one's put a high-powered video projector inside the handset. There's also seemingly endless innovation around accessories, gadgets and personalisation. With sales of new mobiles down, breathing new life and functionality into existing models seems to be the focus.
And that is our show for this week, but there's more for you online at aljazeera.com/CTC. That'll take you straight to our page, which has individual reports, links and entire episodes for you to catch up on. You can also get in touch with us by tweeting me at KAMAHL. Do use the hashtag AJCTC when you tweet, or just drop us an email. Counting the cost at aljazeera.net is the address. That is it, though, for this edition of Counting the Cost. I'm KAMAHL Santamaria from the whole team. Thanks for joining us. The news on Al Jazeera is next.